Well, Frank, thank you so much for talking to me this morning for my project. I was
Sure.
just listening to the overview effect last night, actually,
What were
and
you listening to?
the audiobook version.
Oh, the book itself.
Yeah,
Great, great.
yeah, the third edition, I think.
Yeah. There's a
Um,
lot out there on the internet with the overview effect. So I have to ask what were you listening to? I'm glad you were listening to the original document. That's great.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about yourself and how you ended up getting into this research. I know in the book you talk about kind of an aha moment while you're flying over Washington, D.C. and
Yeah.
seeing the people there, but I was wondering if if you had already been looking at um, situations like this before that aha moment, or kind of like how you got
Yeah.
into this area.
Well, to make a long story short, I've been interested in space exploration and astronomy more or less as long as I can remember. Uh, my first cousin tells me that I was talking about it when I was 5 years old. Um, I don't recall that that is the case. Maybe it might have been happening, and then you know I got a book from my mother called Stars that was about astronomy, and that was a big beginning for me. From there into science fiction, Isaac Asimov and all the great writers, and also I experienced the launch of Sputnik in 1957. And that actually created quite a transformation in American society. There was an entire uh, viewpoint that we had to catch up. The Soviet Union was ahead. So I was at a relatively small school in Mississippi, and they changed the school dramatically. They started creating advanced classes for certain students, probably something we wouldn't support today, doing that kind of tracking, but I know it was helpful to me. And I recall, and I wish I could find what I was writing. I remember at the age of 13 or 14 writing about space, trying to understand what it all meant. And again, I was interested in rockets, but it wasn't really my focus. It was really what does it mean for humanity? And so ultimately, like many of us, I wanted to be an astronaut. Thought that would be a great job, if you will. But it didn't really play to my strengths. I'm not a math and science person. I'm a social science and history person. So I went to Harvard, which really did play to my strengths, and spent a good bit of time wondering how do I get into space with this kind of a degree. And Gerard K. O'Neill came to my rescue. Most people don't really remember how important he was, but he founded the Space Studies Institute, which was a welcoming environment for people from all kinds of backgrounds. And it was actually the epiphany happened because I was thinking constantly about living in an O'Neill community between the Earth and the Moon. He had very specific ideas about how we should settle. And it wasn't on the moon or Mars, it was in free space, as we call it. And that was when I had the insight looking out the window at the airplane of, well, if I lived in that kind of community, I would always have this overview of planet Earth, and I would just know things about the Earth that we find very hard to grasp, like the fact that everything is interconnected, there are no borders or boundaries. And that was the beginning of serious work on the topic. And I can say more if you like about how I proceeded from there.
Oh, absolutely. But just one little comment about the Jerry O'Neill and about how important he is. Um, Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin, it's you wonder if he would have followed on his passion about the encouragement that he got from O'Neill why he was over there at Princeton. So
You're absolutely right. Again, it's a little known fact that Jeff Bezos is spending money to realize the O'Neill vision. Jerry didn't have money. None of us who followed him had any money. It was just the power of the ideas. And you know, there was no SpaceX or Blue Origin then. It was the big companies and NASA and the other, you know, space agencies. And so about all we could do was to try to influence the government programs towards space communities, building, you know, not just missions, but going to stay. However, one of the great moments in history is the fact that Jeff Bezos is dedicating his efforts to essentially reproducing the O'Neill vision. And one of the important parts of that is that it's inherently ecological in nature. That is to say, it's not about running away from the problems of planet Earth. And Bezos has said that many times. This is the best planet in the solar system, and we need to preserve it. So, as I've said, we have gone past the carrying capacity of our planet, right? We can choose many different paths from here, but we can't keep going the way we are. One of the paths that's not looked at is, as I've said, some of us need to leave the planet without leaving it behind. We need to leave it as much to save the planet and our society as we are for the adventure of going to Mars and the moon and various other benefits of space exploration. So anyway, going back to the story, I had what you would call a hypothesis. It was a hypothesis about the future, about space settlements, space communities. And being trained as a social scientist, I wanted to look for data. How do I confirm? And I realized, well, this is very far in the future. There are no space settlers. And so I decided to interview astronauts as proxies. And so I called up NASA and I said, I need to interview all the astronauts right away. And I was envisioning a major social science study with a large database, you know. And the guy at the other end of the line was quite amused. And he told me if I came to Houston, I could interview 2 astronauts, which was not a very big sample size. But I was grateful. And then he just suggested, and I wish I knew who it was. It was just whoever answered the phone. But he said, you should interview the retired astronauts. Oh, I never thought of that. And I didn't really think I could. And I realized, oh, they're independent people now. They don't work for NASA. So I did. I started interviewing them. And the reason I never did the big study was that I was fortunate enough to get a contract from Houghton Mifflin to write the book, the first edition. And so instead of 200 or 300 people in my database, I had 16. And that was really, I think, enough in my mind to move it from a hypothesis to a theory. And you know, I've looked this up on the internet. A hypothesis is an idea about phenomena that doesn't have supporting data. A theory is a hypothesis with some data, some information to support it. So I would say right now the overview effect is a theory about spaceflight. Also, I've used it to predict the future of space exploration. So that's another good thing about a theory. But there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, I'm up to 41 astronauts that I've interviewed now, but there are a lot of ways to look at that information. And see if the hypothesis is really confirmed.
And you mentioned people have various degrees of an experience. Some have a really strong experience, and some don't seem to
Yeah.
indicate they have any experience at all. Oh, what do you think are the biggest factors in terms of determining if somebody will have such an experience?
You know, I always go back to my interview with Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, Apollo 14. And he had a lot of interesting things to say. He said everybody had the same experience, but it's interpreted differently depending on the person, their history, their background. And he also said the difference between an aha experience and something more routine was being open. And I am paraphrasing the actual quotes in the book. But I've gone back to that over and over again to try to explain why some people really, really come back with something remarkable and others come back with less dramatic changes. However, I really do agree with him. Everyone has the experience because everyone who goes into outer space really sees the Earth and the universe in a way that none of the rest of us have. And so that happens. So if you call that the experience, every astronaut has it, right? Does it get interpreted or explained or absorbed differently? Yes, because every human being is different. And I think that's the explanation. I've also called it the overview and the effect. So you could say everyone gets the overview, that's undeniable. The effect on each person may vary. And it's interesting because Edgar Mitchell was as open as anyone, and he had one of the most extraordinary interpretations of the experience of anyone. And I've recently interviewed Charlie Walker, who I interviewed back in 1985, and he and I have been talking about how it's like a time release capsule. The recollection of the experience may change over time, and it may change because of new life experiences, but it may also change simply because the organism, the brain, the person is absorbing, reinterpreting, and you know, beginning to understand it better or beginning to feel it in a different way. Um, I do think it's important to say a lot of people have said, can you experience the overview effect on Earth? And my answer is not exactly, in the sense that the way I've defined the overview effect is being in orbit or going to the moon, being at a distance visually from the planet, being weightless. It's also very quiet out there. And then your sense of time changes because you're going around the planet every 90 minutes or so. You're seeing sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset. A lot of people look at the experience primarily visual, but there are a lot of other factors there. And so I believe you can experience insights similar to what the astronauts experience. I mean, clearly my work started with an experience on an airplane. And in the book, I call it a mild version of the overview effect. However, if we stick with the definition, it is an astronaut experience that maybe we can replicate and simulate, maybe we can simulate it with virtual reality. Maybe we can come really, really close. So I'm not saying we can't come close to it, but if we're talking about the real experience or the real opportunity, you need to be in orbit or you need to go to the moon. And one other thing, those two experiences are very different. Um, when you're in orbit, the Earth is primary in your visual field. You can see beyond it, you can see stars, you can see the cosmos, but when you go to the moon, you see the Earth literally hanging there against the dark backdrop of the universe. And that is undeniably different.
And how do you think those first travelers to Mars, as the ball gets smaller and smaller and smaller and becomes a point, I imagine their experience would be even different than the lunar astronauts.
It will be. And there are a couple of things about that. A psychiatrist named Nick Canis has worked on this question of psychological issues going to Mars. And he talks about the Earth out of view phenomenon and speculates that it could be very challenging for people. And I think it's true. Um, I remember when I went to Europe on a ship. Um, I did that twice, went to Europe on a ship. And I have a very vivid memory of New York City disappearing in the background. And looking ahead, there was nothing but ocean. And it was unsettling, to be honest. It was pretty clear, what I knew and what I understood was not there anymore. And we were in the middle of this vast ocean. And, I was hoping we'd get to Europe without any trouble. Most people do. But I've sort of thought of it metaphorically like that. So let's say you've made the commitment to go to Mars and you know it's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to be on a spacecraft for several months. You're going to a planet that is not welcoming to people like the Earth. You've prepared yourself as well as you can, but the first people to go to Mars are going to be the first people to actually see the Earth disappear. That's never happened to a human being before, really. I mean, people have gone to the moon, they have seen the Earth diminish in size. But if you look at pictures of the Earth from the moon, you can see it's the Earth. There it is. That's what I know. Ultimately, when you land on Mars, the Earth will be a point of light in the sky. And in my book, I talked about other changes in consciousness beyond the overview effect. And one of them I called the Copernican Perspective, i.e., the realization we live in a solar system. And the Earth is not the primary part of the solar system. It's one planet of many. I believe the Martian settlers are going to have that shift. It's going to be more than just what we call the overview effect. It's going to be that next stage, realizing our place first in the solar system and then in the cosmos.
I keep thinking from a psychological standpoint, humanity's place in the universe has been continuously on the decline. We went from being, the only world out there, the center of everything, to being the center of something and special, to being, well, there's a whole bunch of other planets out there that are just like ours, and they might have life too that's just like ours. Um, I, in some respects, does that demotivate society?
That's a very powerful question. We know that, speaking of Copernicus, we know that the resistance to a heliocentric view of the solar system was so fierce that the church condemned people. The church fought it because, from their point of view, they saw what it implied. In other words, the church wants to see humanity as a special creation of God. And this view was really counter to that. I did some research on this for a project, and the heliocentric model had been proposed 1,000 years before. I mean, Copernicus really laid it out in a way that European society could grasp it. And it was also the beginning of the Renaissance, when people were beginning to shift their thinking to a more scientific view. But as I recall, Copernicus was so frightened of what might happen, he did not publish his book until he was on his deathbed.
Hmm.
I've seen an engraving of him lying in bed and somebody's showing him, here's your book, you know. Um, and the term revolution is part of the title of the book. And when we talk about revolution, I believe it really comes from that concept, because it was just so dramatic. And over time, we have, as humans, had to rethink our place on the earth. Um, there's a big shift in awareness right now, more toward Gaian thinking, away from we are the conquerors of nature, we are the most important life form, we're in charge of this planet, to a much more collaborative, ecological view of humanity. We're part of the planet. We aren't necessarily the most important. We certainly are the most powerful, and we could play a positive or negative role in the evolution of the planet. In my other book, The Cosmo Hypothesis, I suggest a hypothesis, which is to ask, why is it that nature and the cosmos have allowed evolution on the earth to happen in the way it has happened? Because actually it is rather special. Uh, we think it could have happened elsewhere, but we can't prove it yet. Not only did life appear on this planet, but life evolved to the point where we have a species that is ready to be a spacefaring species. Um, why? What what can we give back to the universe for this gift of spaceflight? And the reason I wrote this book is I realized back in the 80s, after the Challenger accident, a lot of people were asking, what's the purpose of space exploration? If people are going to die, there needs to be a purpose. And most of the answers were human centered. We get this out of that, we get that out of that. But again, if you look at the earth, you can't just keep taking from the earth. You need to give back. You need to be in harmony with the planet. And I think that my hypothesis is that humanity is a way of spreading life and intelligence and self-awareness throughout the universe. And in that sense, we could be very important. Um, and I found quite a few people are open to this concept. Not only that, quite a few people have written books that more or less parallel what I've said. So it could turn out we're awfully important, but not if we keep thinking of ourselves as important, and not if we keep trying to figure out how can we take from the universe instead of give.
You mentioned that more people having this experience would probably be good for society. And SpaceX is working on the Starship, which they plan to use for point-to-point Earth travel, and
Mhm.
believe they could be profitable at an equivalent first-class airline ticket. And you might have people flying from Houston to Beijing within like 30 or 40 minutes. With the top part of that, they're above the Earth's atmosphere. They get to see the blackness of space, the curvature of the Earth. They get, maybe 5, 6 minutes of free fall. So they have the weightlessness. Um, well, assuming that becomes in wide use, what kind of effect would you expect to see from that?
It could be quite dramatic if you think about it, because right now the only way as a person of ordinary means that you could imagine getting an astronaut experience would be, let's say, Virgin Galactic ticket for $250,000, which is it's more obtainable than being a NASA astronaut, which is really hard to do, but it's still a lot of money for most of us. There's also Space Perspective is going to launch a stratospheric balloon that'll be less expensive, and that's great. And I'm all for that as well. And then Blue Origin hasn't made its plans very open, but we know they're looking at space tourism. All of these things are great. However, what you're talking about could be cheaper, and also it could be more widespread more quickly. And that could be a good thing, because one of the interesting things I found out that I did not know, and I'm not probably going to be able to give you specifics here, but I had a journalist interview me about my flight, my epiphany while flying. And she told me that there's evidence of quite a few major new ideas happening to people on airplanes, innovative ideas. And so if we have this point-to-point flight that you're talking about, and it can be more widespread than the other ideas that are being proposed, and if we could get to it more quickly, we could have a lot of impact. Because, you know, one of the things that I've tried to point out in thinking about impact of this kind of experience is that you don't have to have everybody have the experience. I mean, Edgar Mitchell came back and founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is a remarkable institution studying consciousness, and talking about the overview effect, talking about what he experienced, working on creating virtual reality versions of his experience. You don't, I mean, you take a sample of 1,000 people, and if one of them has the experience, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be what we're talking about. If that person has a lot of drive, a lot of determination, or even if that one person has a substantial amount of money, that one person can make a big change, even if the other people just go about living their lives. So it's a long way of saying, I think point-to-point travel of the kind you're describing could be really quite significant.
Yeah, and just as you look out at the future of humanity, it seems like you're very hopeful that things might go in a good direction, and that you know, a few hundred years from now, we might have people scattered throughout the solar system. Is that indeed your vision, or do you see something that's kind of blocking us from doing that?
It is my vision. I do believe it's extremely important to think through what that will look like. For many years, I was an advocate of space exploration, because it seemed like that's what we needed to do, was to advocate that we could do something like that. I am not so much of an advocate anymore as what would be the term? I am an advocate, but I'm an advocate of doing it right. So simply spreading humanity out into the rest of the solar system is not the end goal. It's doing it in a good way. We had a fantastic outburst of exploration on the Earth back in the 15th, 16th centuries. But there's a lot there that we'd like to have a do-over, in the sense of how the explorers treated the environment, indigenous people, the purpose, why they did it. It was a great period of exploration, but there was a lot of exploitation. So I believe we need to think through what it's going to look like. And I've started an organization called the Human Space Program to do just that. We're going to tackle all the big heavy duty issues. We are going to talk about rocket ships and engineering, because For example, how fast you can get to Mars will affect what psychological and biological issues are going to be for human beings. So rockets are important. Reusability has been a very important development. But what we're really interested in is ethics and social change. And again, having a plan that includes the Earth in a positive way. And nothing is absolute, I guess would be the word. There's no way you can say if 1,000,000 people go to Mars, that's a good thing. It depends on what they do, really. A lot of people who are in the space movement are interested in this TV series called The Expanse. And it's a really imaginative view of the future. A lot of it, I think, is the way it could turn out. But most people I know think that isn't the way they want it to turn out, with the Earth and Mars being in conflict. And there is a very good chance that could be the way it turns out. Nobody really thought when English settlers came to the New World, they would be in conflict with England. That was not really in the cards. But for many, many reasons, including distance and poor political decisions by the crown, it ended up being a war. And so you look at that and you ask yourself, well, how do we avoid that?
And indeed, you mentioned before it's only a matter of influence, just a few individuals who go off and do things. I mean, it seems like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are quite capable of doing independently what they're interested in doing. And I imagine the same's true of China and India and Russia and other groups as well. I mean, how do you get that kind of buy-in to actually address these issues? It just seems like the type of situation where you have a cartel or someplace where the first person to break the agreement gets the most out of it.
Yeah. No, you're right. The human space program, the organization I've co-founded, we've made it very clear we have no power other than the power of opinion. And our plan is to create task forces that will consider every significant issue. And then we will put that together into a comprehensive plan that will lay out a sustainable, inclusive, and ethical evolution of humanity into what we call the solar ecosystem. It's like anything else. It will be promoted widely, and it will either have adherence or not. Once we have it, we will ask Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk if they agree, if they'll abide by it, and they may well say no, and that's their prerogative. I have no influence whatsoever in China. I wouldn't even know how to have influence there. But like any other country, they can be affected by opinion, global opinion. As I've talked to people, I've found very few people who say, oh, no, we don't need a plan. We should just go out into the solar system willy-nilly. The strong will dominate and will terraform Mars and will mine the moon, and that's the way it's going to be. I've talked to very few people who think that's the way to do it. I think most people that I've talked to think a comprehensive plan is a great idea, and it's something to aim at. People can pick pieces of it off of the plan and maybe implement them, or we can have a rousing global debate about the plan.
I wanted to be respectful of your time. Do you have more time?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think a large part of it is that vision, right? You talked in your book about JFK's efforts to reach out to the Soviet Union to go to the moon together,
Right.
and how different it might have unfolded if that had happened. And you talk about the people that most need the overview effect are probably the least likely to get it, the politicians, what have you. And I kind of envision, what if we put like the UN in orbit? Everybody had to go up there. I was just
Yeah.
wondering if you had some thoughts on that.
Well, let's start with President Kennedy. It's remarkable how few people know that he did not want Apollo to be competitive. He wanted it to be cooperative. And that's a remarkable thing to think about, um, given what the intensity of the rivalry in the 60s. It was pretty scary, let's say. And President Kennedy, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened in his mind, but I believe from what I've done research on, he wanted to see space exploration as a way of unwinding the Cold War. And initially, the Soviet Union leaders rebuffed him. But then in 1962, we had a major crisis where we almost had a nuclear war called the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think everybody looked at that and said, we can't go on like this. And the Soviet leaders were not insane. I mean, they were following an ideology just as we were, and that's what it led to. And I think they were intelligent enough to say, well, let's see. And they were actually moving toward cooperation. And in 1963, he made a speech at the UN where he went beyond that and said, why doesn't everybody participate? Every nation. So essentially, he was talking about a human space program instead of a national space program. And I didn't get any of my information from secret sources. It's all out there. But the usual interpretation of that period is it was a Cold War thing, and Kennedy wasn't really interested in space exploration. And there's just a lot of ideas about what happened that aren't accurate, really. So yes, I think we would be in a different place today if he had not been assassinated. On the other hand, we do have the International Space Station, which has been continuously occupied by different uh, nationalities for 20 years. I think President Kennedy would be very impressed with that. And I think he would say, this is what I was talking about. Now, unfortunately, the Chinese are not able to participate because of legal legislation passed in the US. However, we do have the opportunity again for a do-over. We do have an opportunity for more collaboration and more cooperation as we move out into the other parts of the solar system. And so President Kennedy, if he had not died, might have had enough political influence to realize that vision. So I think, again, it goes back to what can be done with enough vision and enough effort behind it. And I do think the biggest barriers right now to realizing such a vision are not technical. I mean, Elon Musk has showed we can do remarkable things technologically. And so has Bezos, and so has Richard Branson. I mean, these three people, with NASA's help in some cases, have done remarkable engineering feats. But it's more like, is there political and social will to do it? And in the United States, I can't speak for other countries, but in the United States, I would say one of the biggest barriers is the belief on the part of some sectors of society that space exploration is a joyride for the rich, an effort to escape the planet. And I think it's difficult when you see who is actually leading the way, which is billionaires. Unless you know those billionaires, it's difficult to realize that in some cases, at least, they are as interested in helping the Earth to be a better place as they are in space exploration. I think that story has to get out there. I mean, I interviewed Richard Branson for the third edition of my book, and he's an environmentalist. I mean, he's pretty open. He wants to take people out there so they can experience the overview effect and come back and do good things on planet Earth. We also have, an organization called Space for Humanity. I'm on the advisory council. Same idea, choosing people from diverse backgrounds to have the experience, but not to hold it to themselves, but to bring it back and do something with it. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Overview Institute. I could name many organizations where, yes, space exploration is interesting and important to them, but not leaving the Earth behind. So that's a message that needs to get out.
In your book, you also mentioned that, some people say we sent the wrong people. We sent engineers and test pilots when we should be sending artists and poets. I think the part where I left off in the book last night was some people said the perfect crew for the Apollo program was a priest, a poet. Oh, and what was the third one? But the joke was, but then they all died because they couldn't fly the plane or the craft. But
Well, I think Michael Collins said that, and quite a few astronauts have said that. And of course, what they're talking about is that you do need engineers, you do need pilots, and obviously you cannot possibly uh, guide a lunar module to the surface of the moon if you're not a really good pilot. Um, what they're getting at, though, is something that's very interesting. Joe Allen, who was the first person I interviewed for my book, or the first retired astronaut anyway, he said for all the reasons pro and con that were advanced for going to the moon, no one said we should do it to look at the Earth, but that may have been the most important reason. And Bill Anders said something similar. Other astronauts have said that. The purpose of going to the moon was not to look at the Earth, but it turned out that was probably the most important part of the trip. Similarly, even though astronauts are well aware today of the overview effect, and so is NASA, they are not sent to the International Space Station to look at the Earth. They are sent there to do scientific experiments and to maintain the station. So now we are at a point where we're talking about poets, we're talking about priests, we're talking about people of all kinds of backgrounds. And I think that is going to have a huge impact again, because I don't agree that astronauts are not good at describing their experience. I've interviewed more than 40 of them. I think they're pretty good at it. And if you read my book and if you listen, I mean, NASA now has a series of videos on YouTube called Down to Earth. And I was the first interviewer. I interviewed 10 astronauts for that. And now it's been carried forward by other people at Johnson Space Center. And I think the astronauts are pretty good at talking about it. However, poets have a different way of expressing what they've seen and felt. Novelists, painters, Nicole Stott, one of the shuttle and ISS astronauts, is devoting her life to art as a way of communicating the experience. And so, I mean, if you think about how do we describe the experience of living on this spaceship that we're on right now? Spaceship Earth. There are millions of ways to do it, and that's what we call art and religion and science and technology. And um, of course, it will be better when we have a far more diverse group of people, and not just artists and poets and so on, but people of different backgrounds and different ethnicities and different economic uh, strata. Uh, they're going to see things differently from trained, highly professional astronauts, of course.
And I was just thinking about the Dear Moon project, that billionaire that's planning to take a group of, I think, 7 to 9 artists
Yeah,
around the moon, maybe as early as 2023.
yeah,
I was wondering, uh, I mean, what kind of differences would you expect out of them? I
yeah.
mean, on one hand, if you're in a state of trauma, your ability to experience the thing could be different, and artists are by nature maybe a little bit more sensitive to things.
Mhm. Well, one of the reasons I support Dear Moon and I support the Artemis project is that I had a realization as I was preparing to teach a class a couple of years ago that most of the people in my class did not experience the Apollo moon missions directly. They didn't experience Earthrise. They didn't experience that moment when the astronauts turned the camera back and showed us the Earth for the first time. I did a calculation, which might be totally off, but I calculated only 17% of the people alive today had experienced Apollo. And so that means that this very, very different aspect of the overview effect um, has not happened since 1972, the last moon mission. So I think it could have a really positive impact, especially today. In 1972, we didn't have the ways we have today of disseminating images and stories and so on. Also, that would answer the whole thing about we sent the wrong people to the moon. I mean, it's the right people. Similarly, Artemis is going to be a landing of the first woman on the moon. I think symbolically that's terribly important. Um, I've talked to some of the women astronauts at NASA, and they are a remarkable group of people. And I, I just think whoever gets chosen, they will do a great job of sharing that experience. So I, I believe it's very important. And again, the vast majority of people don't make a distinction between being in orbit or being on the moon. I didn't. When I started the research, I hadn't thought about it. It didn't take long for me to realize, wow, it's not really the same, is it?
Yeah, I was talking to a person the other day, and I had this vision of a suited figure sitting on the moon, meditating, looking at the Earth, and it
Yeah.
just seems like that would be kind of a powerful place to be.
One of the ideas that you mentioned in passing before was a summit conference in space, and I have a friend named Duncan McKenzie who would like to use virtual reality to take the members of the United Nations into orbit. Uh, you know, uh, it'd be complicated to do, but one of the one of the ideas a lot of people have had is it's going to be hard to get world leaders into orbit or on the moon, but could we simulate it and have them meet virtually on the moon or in orbit? And I think, you could do that. There has also been talk of spiritual communities on the moon. Again, the moon is not going to be a really easy place to live, right? Uh, you can imagine people saying, I don't think I really want to go there because it's going to be a hard life. But religious communities in many years past were all often established in remote, difficult places to encourage meditation, contemplation, communing with God or with the universe. One could imagine a spiritual community on the moon precisely because it's far away and precisely because there's not a lot of distraction, and it could be very supportive of spiritual practice. Yeah, so I think your vision is pretty accurate.
Yeah, the ultimate monastery, huh?
The ultimate monastery, and why not? I mean, if you imagine that everything we do on Earth we will do elsewhere in the universe, there will be churches, there will be monasteries, there will be everything we have on Earth. It'll be different. One of the big issues we have, I think, going back to Mars, is terraforming. That is to say, this is a wonderful planet, in my opinion. Mars has its own charm, just the way it is, you know. Elon Musk has talked about terraforming because he doesn't think people will want to go there if it's not more like Earth. This is part of what I want the human space program to think about. I mean, is our vision of the future that we will go create many Earths? Will we make the universe more like Earth? Well, this is a great planet. Maybe that's a good thing. But I sort of like the idea of humans adapting to where we go with minimal interference. And I do believe we're going to want to establish wilderness areas in the solar system. As we have on Earth, there are certain places we don't reconstitute in any way. And I believe that we will want to do that in outer space. But it's a debate we ought to have. I mean, if we could make Mars more like Earth, is that something we want to do? Or would it be more powerful for us to become more adapted to Mars? One analogy there, when the Europeans came to North America, they encountered people who knew how to live here and were living here. In theory, they could have turned to each other and said, you know, the indigenous people here really know how to live here very well. Let's do what they do. But the Europeans didn't do that. They came here and said, you need to do what we do. You need to live the way we live. And that really was part of the entire conflict throughout what now is the United States and Canada and so on, where the idea was, no, the way you've been living for all these years is not good, and you have to adapt to our way. And we are going to adapt this environment to our way. So again, in theory, they didn't have to do that. And before we terraform Mars, I'd like for people to think, you know, what's really the most ethical and appropriate and ecological strategy for humanity off the Earth.
It's a really good timing for that thought about the Europeans coming to North America, considering next week, or this week is Thanksgiving, actually.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's interesting too, the way we look at Thanksgiving, the way we look at the settling of the West in the United States, the way we look back at the history of European settling and immigration, if you will, to the New World is being questioned, appropriately being questioned. And certainly the way I've thought about it has changed pretty dramatically. I think Thanksgiving can be a time to give thanks. That's a good thing, and we should do that. If we didn't have the pandemic, it would be a time to gather with our families. But insofar as it really looks back to that first contact between Europeans and indigenous people, there's a lot in there that we really have to, I think we have to come to terms with. And the way the story is told, it was a remarkable moment in which the Europeans and the Native Americans actually came together. And it was a brief moment when the situation was positive, but it didn't last. So we have to think about how to deal with that. And we don't think we're going to run into indigenous people on Mars or the moon. But again, it's really the attitude that's more important than that. And how much of it is exploration, how much of it is exploitation.
I have talked to a few people who aren't really space people, and I'm like, what do you think we might discover on the moon? And like a few of them have said aliens, so it's not universally accepted uh, a limitation.
Well, of course, that is an entirely different conversation where it may turn out that we do have contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, and the situation will be reversed. They will be more advanced technologically than we are. They will be further along in their evolution than we are. And that was part of what was so traumatic, really, when the Europeans came to North and South America, in the sense that they weren't necessarily better, more intelligent, or nicer than the people who were here, but they had technology that gave them an advantage. The whole issue of first contact with extraterrestrials is a big one. There's no, well, I realize some people think there's evidence they're on the moon, but I don't think there's any solid evidence of that. But we'll have to see. We'll see.
Yeah, it's difficult. You tend to only find the things you look for, and
Right.
so if it was safe and affordable, would you take a trip to space?
Well, I'm hoping to. I'm planning to. I mean, um, I was being interviewed by a person who's now become a good friend, Christina Rasmussen, on her podcast. And we were talking the way you and I are talking. And she said, well, are you planning to go? And my first response was, well, yeah, but I don't have the money to do that. And then I realized, I've been so focused on capturing other people's experiences, I haven't put much energy into having that experience myself. So initially, the reason was, well, I don't have the right training to be an astronaut. And now it's, I don't have the money. But those are two really different things in a way, because, competing against, I don't know, 10,000 people to become a NASA astronaut, the odds are long. But raising $250,000 or whatever it would be for something you really want to do, well, that's doable. So yeah, so I'm working on going, but my approach is not to do it for myself. It's not a bucket list thing. I would want to document it. I'd want to share it. I'd want it to be an overview effect project. I would like for it to be a project that would raise all the questions you and I are talking about. The astronauts, the NASA astronauts, feel like they really want to share their story because we sent them. They represent us. And if I were to go into orbit or even to the moon, that's how I'd want to do it. It is certainly, from a personal point of view, after all this time of talking about the overview effect, yeah, I'd like to experience it. But if that's all it is, I don't think it would be as worthwhile as sharing it, documenting it, bringing people along. So that's my goal.
think that'd be awesome. I could see a whole bunch of people wanting to support you in that endeavor. And like you said, 250,000 is, I mean, it's a house, but at the same token, um, you know, it's very very reachable.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. For some people, it's a lot of money. For some people, it's pocket change. And I remember when I was growing up, I didn't have any money. You know, I was in a very poor family. And I was fortunate to get a scholarship to Harvard. But after that happened, somebody told me there was a man in my hometown who was going to send me to college
Hmm.
because he thought I deserved to go. You know, I didn't know him very well. Um, we weren't friends, but I knew him. It was a small town. And that touched me that he was prepared to do that just because he thought I deserved to go and I would do something good with it. So I would like to have the same kind of support where people would support me to do this because they just think, well, you'll do something useful with it. And I do that for other people. I don't have a lot of money, but I support people who I think will do something good with an experience.
Absolutely. No, that makes 100% sense. Well, Frank, unfortunately I have to go, but I really appreciate the time. Is there any last thoughts that we didn't get to that you wanted to toss in?
Well, I'll just say that I do believe that exploration is probably in the human genetic makeup. There's a lot of talk about that, and there's some evidence of it. And I believe it's important to our evolution. I also believe it need not be for the few. I believe it can be for all of humanity. And we can't change, actually, we can change our genes now, but the fact that it's part of our makeup is not what we need to change. It's our understanding of the meaning of space exploration and the value of it. That's where the work is right now. And that's what I'm working on. So I
Yeah,
hope I hope to have more people join me in that effort.
I fully support what you're doing, and I hope you get the people that you need.
I hope so too. And thank you for what you're doing, Nathan. It's really pretty impressive project. So keep up the good work.
Thanks, Frank, and I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.